those who want an inside scoop into what Australia's elite are doing, the CBD column, published in the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, is a must-read. In fact, it is possibly one of the most read features in Australian media. If a deal is being arranged behind closed doors, CBD is the first to know. They've broken stories about courtroom dramas, political stoushes, high-profile birthday parties, royal tour schedules, and so much more. Kishor Napier-Raman is a columnist for CBD, and he joins me today to talk about big egos, saucy stories, and diversity in media. Kishor, thank you for joining us on Indian Link.
Hi Manan, so good to be here.
Now Kishor, the CBD column gets all the inside scoops, whether it's where Pat Cummins is dining or who's having a go at Premier Chris Minns now. Tell me, how do you get these stories?
Well, firstly, I've got to say, you're puffing me up way too much here. Look, I get some good scoops and I have some idea of what's going on, but most of my day is sort of spent scrambling around being like, what is happening? How am I going to figure it out? Like, who is going where and what? Look, how do you get scoops? That's like the kind of big bread and butter question for anyone working in journalism. It's a real mix of things. Look, obviously, a lot of my job is like maintaining good relationships with sources and contacts throughout sort of politics, business, and the media. People who are kind of in the room and in the inner circles who might be able to tell me and gossip to me about what's going on. But a lot of it is actually, and a lot of what I do really also focuses on things that are just out there in the public record and being able to know where to look. Things like registers of politicians' interests and stuff like that, which show you kind of which corporate is buying which politician a ticket to the AFL Grand Final, for example, and things like that. There's a lot of public information out there that you know, being able to trawl throughout the day. There's no one kind of formula.
Now, the CBD column breaks stories that other columns don't. What do you think about people who are willing to spill the tea, so to speak, on other people? Is dishing the dirt on their opponent the sweetest form of revenge? Or is it sometimes better to, again, so to speak, have a Bex and a good lie down?
I'm obviously deeply indebted to some very gossipy people. Some of them are my best sources. But I think every journalist has this issue when someone is telling you something, especially when it's something a little bit, shall we say, red hot, when it's something a little bit salacious, when it's something that someone doesn't want to know about, you obviously have to think about what their agenda is. I think everyone operating in politics, in business, a lot of people do have agendas that they want to push. And often you do get sources that really, really want you to run something, and you sometimes have to just take a step back and think, why do they want this out there so badly? People with axes to grind and vendettas that they have, that they use the media act out. But I guess as a journalist, your role is to be judicious about what you run. So go to the other side for comment and clarification and that kind of thing. So I think if you do all your due diligence as a journalist, then sometimes it doesn't even really matter too much whether the person who's giving you the story might have slightly ulterior motives.
Are there any stories which were too saucy to run?
If there's too saucy to run, they're far too saucy for me to talk about here, unfortunately. So you do have to make a kind of value judgment about whether you think something is getting too close to someone's personal life. I mean, there's a long debate about what aspects of a public figure's personal and family life is fair game for media reporting. I don't think there's a hard and fast rule about that, but you obviously will always approach that on a kind of case-by-case basis. There are things we can't run, obviously, for legal reasons. Obviously, defamation laws in Australia are difficult and a real issue for anyone working in the media. Sydney is called the defamation capital of the world, I think for good reason. The barrier for a journalist as a defendant in a hypothetical defamation case is always very high. So everything I write has to go through the lawyers every day, basically. And if there are things that we just don't think we can stand up to the standard that we could potentially defend that in a courtroom, then we're not going to run it.
Without naming any names, are there any stories that you'd really like to run? Or any stories you'd really like to break?
Yeah, let's just say there's a lot of stuff on some very senior political leaders that I would like to write that I can't yet. But watch this space. Maybe it will come together soon. Yeah.
Now, media issue is a really hot topic at the moment. I mean, you look at the mainstream TV channels, you don't see too many reporters of colour, and we've obviously had the ABC report into racism in the national broadcaster. Are you surprised about the lack of representation in Australian media? And what do you think needs to change to make our media more reflective of a modern Australia?
I could talk about this for a very long time. Could, I really could. So, look, a couple of parts to that question. I wasn't at all sort of surprised by what was found in the ABC report. The fact that the ABC, as the public broadcaster, is finally doing a report about this kind of thing is great, but most of the media isn't like the ABC and is probably not going to do something like that quite yet. I mean, you know, the company I work, we're doing work around diversity as well, where senior rungs of leadership across the media are taking stock and realizing that they need to make change, which is a good thing. Maybe it's too late, but it's good that there is leadership that is aware of that and wanting to change. I also think that, sticking to Australia, our conversations around cultural diversity and representation are lagging a little bit. I think it's now sort of incumbent on leaders in newsrooms to continue to try to change those problems, and there are many that are attuned to this, and that's good. But also, yeah, happens when you get more diversity into ranks of leadership, that trickles down through the whole organisation, because people have subconscious biases and hire people that look and feel like themselves. That's starting to happen, and there's more good work to be done to make the media a more equitable place that looks more like modern Australia.
What kind of benefits do you think a diverse media landscape would bring to journalism? Is it the removal of that subconscious bias?
Yeah, absolutely. But I always think about it as like a big missed opportunity, because I think you just tell better stories, right? Let's just look at a city like Sydney. Sydney is a very, very diverse city, and like many diverse cities, people live in their little bubbles and pockets a little bit. And I think the South Asian community is itself big and diverse, right? But there are things that happen and issues and debates within that community that I just frankly think that like an Anglo-Australian without much exposure to that community just wouldn't know about. But a reporter of Indian origin would know about those things and would be able to chase those stories and would have built up a degree of trust with people within the community to be able to tell those stories well. And it's the same for the Chinese Australian community, or particularly at the moment, like when there's so many issues around the war in the Middle East, people from Arab, Lebanese, Palestinian Australian communities, being able to tell the stories of those communities. So really, I think of it as a big strength and a huge source of untapped potential for the media in this country, because at the end of the day, you just do better journalism.
Now, Kishore, I understand that you studied arts and law and then went to cover politics in the Canberra Press Gallery. How did that happen?
Yeah, it was a kind of a series of fortunate or unfortunate events. So I was doing my law degree at USyd, and I started working for On Histoire, the student paper there, which is a really fabulous student newspaper and really gave a lot of people throughout the decades their start in journalism. I was one of the 10 editors there, and you get a huge amount of creative freedom and get to basically put together a weekly paper and cosplay as an adult journalist at quite a young age before you really know anything. But yeah, it was a bit of a baptism of fire, but a great experience. And sort of from there, I started working at Crikey, which is a small independent publication that's been around for about 20 years now. They do really good work, obviously a very progressive approach to news and politics. They gave me a really good start, and I was able to work on quite big, important stories there from pretty much the start of my career. So I really owe a lot to them for giving me a shot. And then after a few years there, I moved to Canberra to become their sole correspondent in the Parliamentary Press Gallery, which again was a really good experience. You get a really interesting insight into how politics and power in Australia works, because seeing everything behind the scenes is really fascinating. And then I came back to Sydney to work for the Herald a couple of years ago. So that's kind of been my trajectory into the media.
So you've been covering these kinds of personalities for a while now. What unexpected challenges did you go through when you shifted from covering politics to covering personalities in CBD, if any?
Look, it wasn't a huge jump, because I think what I'm doing now is still very much focused on politics and politicians. People are more receptive to you and less receptive to you, because people know that the way you're approaching things is a bit lighthearted and tongue-in-cheek, and they always enjoy reading it, even if they're sometimes the subject of the column. That makes some people a lot more friendly to you, because even if you're gonna get stuck into them today, they'll have something good for you tomorrow about someone they want to have a crack at. You are dealing with fragile ego all the time, which is always really interesting. But I think for me, one of the biggest shifts was moving from a smaller independent publication to somewhere big like the Herald. Obviously the biggest, probably the most influential paper in the country. I would say it is the most influential paper in the country. Absolutely, I've got to plug the masthead, but when you're working somewhere like that with such a rich history and so tied into the fabric of the country, people are more likely to take your calls, for example, and respond to you. And that was like a real adjustment, because I'd come from a very scrappy upstart publication where it was very difficult to get like a Liberal Party minister or someone like that to ever respond to a phone call, email, inquiry or whatever. and yes, being at the Herald made that part of the job a little bit easier.
To a lot of young people, especially migrants, they face a lot of pressure to do the traditional paths of study, become a doctor, become an engineer, become a lawyer, and they're less encouraged to pursue the arts or pursue communications. What would your advice be to the parents of those young people?
Stop making all your kids become engineers, my God. There's probably another reason why the media industry continues to have problems. I think a lot of people from diverse communities face like social pressures to do things that people equate with, a kind of stable career like law, like medicine. That entrenched viewpoint isn't going to dissolve straight away. But to the parents and to anyone out there, I would say it's also important to foster and to nurture your children's passions. And a lot of people come into journalism and the media out of a sense of passion, and I think that's what makes it such an exciting industry. People aren't doing it to take a paycheck necessarily. People are doing it out of a real kind of passion for storytelling, for news, for current affairs, for all of those things. And I think that, if you allow people to pursue those passions, they end up doing better out of life in the end. I just hope that more people from the Indian community decide to come into journalism, because there need to be more of us.
And you're a pin-up man to those young, emerging, diverse journalists. I'm going to
Really?
blow up your ego a little bit more.
Who knew?
What's your advice to those journalists?
God, so many pieces of advice. Obviously, be persistent and don't be shy. I think I was too shy earlier in my career to be as persistent as I could have been. But I think really practical stuff is get lots of writing or kind of publication experience under your belt. That can be at a student newspaper, that can be at a kind of community publication, somewhere like Indian Link, for example. That can be at, smaller independent organizations as well. Just get practice getting your byline out there and get practice pitching to people. Don't be shy about cold emailing editors and finding places to pitch your writing, because the more experience you get under the belt, the better. Find good mentors, people who are in the industry or have been there for a few years and are willing to talk to you about how it goes or answer any question. I'm always open to answering people's questions about breaking into the media if anyone's curious. Your thing is like radio. There's a lot of great opportunities for people in places like FBI radio to kind of get experience as someone early in their career. Be hungry for it and be really enthused by it. Like,
Who's got bigger egos? The politicians you used to cover or the personalities you now cover?
ooh, can I say the journalists? Sometimes. No. It's a bit of both, to be honest. Like, you get big egos in politics and in business, really. Yeah. I'm going to have to call that one a draw.
Do you ever get nervous breaking a story?
God, terrified sometimes. So I write a daily column and it comes out sort of 5 a.m. in the morning, and there are days where I just like go to bed being like... And funnily enough, it's those days where I go to bed being like, when I always wake up totally fine, no problems. And then there are other days where you think not a care in the world, everything's fine, everything's easy, and you wake up and someone's called up and they don't like whatever, and maybe there's an error, whatever. And those days are really worrying. But yeah, look, every journalist I've spoken to ever still gets that sense of like kind of anxiety, especially when it's like a sensitive story.
One piece of advice you'd give your younger self?
One piece of advice, chill. It's going to be fine.
Kishor, thank you very much for your time today.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.